Here we meet Anne, and she has freckles and red hair and green eyes. And freckles are kind of rare, and green eyes are very rare, and red hair is very rare. So, in a lot of ways, she would be considered very pretty because she's unusual. Green eyes are recessive, and red hair is recessive, and so these are things that are not common traits. And she hates her red hair, though there's no reason to hate red hair. There's no reason to hate anything like that because, hair is hair and it's is what it is and it just is. I have a little bit of red around my face and beard. My brother Peter does too. My dad did. Um, my grandmother, Grandma Lively, had red hair, though a lot of that was the work of chemicals. But uh, she was a natural redhead, or so I was told. So Anne has a lot of questions, and it's great to have a lot of questions. It's important to want to know the answers to things. And I would have been so tempted to go through this chapter. I just put hundreds of little footnotes of this is that, this is the other thing. Um, so when we went up to Prince Edward Island, we actually saw the house where Lucy Maud Montgomery lived and wrote the book, and we saw copies of her papers and such, which was really, really cool, in the house that she grew up in. And we saw the house that was the inspiration for Green Gables, and it was back up in the woods with this little brook rolling by and a bridge, and it was just absolutely beautiful. And they talk about the red roads. And that was one of the things that struck me about Prince Edward Island, is that the earth is this bright red. And the island itself is made out of sandstone. And this is a sandstone that has a lot of iron in it. And iron oxide, I guess it's ferrous oxide with a hydrate, otherwise known as rust, is a bright red. Um, though iron is responsible for a lot of beautiful, beautiful colors. The rust color, the reddish rust, is a nice, pretty color. Um, Pure ferrous oxide is black. There is a color called Prussian blue, which is ferroferrous cyanide. Ferroferrous cyanide. So it has a 2 oxidized iron and a 3 oxidized iron joined by a little cyanide. Now, cyanide is known as toxic. It's a carbon and a nitrogen together. And some versions of cyanide are really, really toxic. But the fun thing about ferroferrocyanide, it is that it's like totally insoluble in water. It just doesn't dissolve in anything. So you have this really stable pigment that isn't going to go anywhere. And this was invented in the 1800s. And it was this just marvelous dye. It was called Prussian blue. But anyway, ferroferrocyanide. And Prince Edward Island, all sandstone. It's slowly crumbling into the sea, which is sad, but that's what happens with islands like that. The Prince Edward Island is a part of the Appalachian Mountains. So the Appalachian Mountains once ran along the coast of North America, up through Canada, and actually continued into Great Britain. Great Britain was once part of the Appalachian Mountains and was actually like right next to Prince Edward Island. And if the Appalachian Trail were done over the course of the original Appalachian Mountains, it would be walking from Georgia to Scotland or the Isle of Man. But between then, Iceland formed. So Europe and North America are moving apart. The plates are splitting. And so as they're moving apart in the mountain range, the Appalachian Mountains are just literally pulling apart. As it pulled apart, the molten core of the Earth sprung up, and the ocean, well, the oceans flooded in, and the molten core of the Earth sprung up. And where it sprung up, there's this ridge down the middle of the Atlantic called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Anyway, Mid-Atlantic Ridge. At the top of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge is Iceland, where it spread apart, and there was enough land there for um, to build up, and so Iceland has all of these volcanoes. So Iceland is one of those islands that isn't actually shrinking. Um, you have Prince Edward Island, which, as I said, is sandstone and crumbling and kind of sinking because the ground is subsiding. And it's sad that, as the waves go in, the waves break down the sandstone and they turn it into sand and they wash it away into the ocean as, it falls down. So it's like a pile of sand just slowly collapsing. And I mean, it's, 50, 100 miles wide. I can't remember. I can look it up. I'll probably should look it up and put in the footnotes. But, it's this island and it's shrinking by a few feet every year, which is really kind of sad. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. The book described going through this avenue, the avenue of trees. And so it's trees growing up on both sides. And one of the cool things that I've noticed is that when you have trees growing next to a road, as trucks and such go by, they knock down bits of trees. And the trees don't grow out because when a tree grows, it grows with, these little tender branches. So you have these little tiny sprout of branches. Well, the truck goes by and knocks off the little sprout of branches. It doesn't even have to touch them because the wind blows the little bits of branch off. So what you have is these trees that have this cut, and it's like a roof where it just, here you have the tree and it goes at this right angle because that's the way the trucks go. Now, back at a time like this, you didn't have trucks, and you had the wagons, and you had the people in the wagons. And so you would have the things in the wagons being piled up, and as they're piled up, it's higher in the middle. So what you end up having is you have this rounded sort of archway. And similar thing, or the thing happened where it talked about the roads being cut down. Sunken roads were very common back then because what happened is the road gets wet and the mud gets pushed out to the side and it wears ruts, and then the water flows down the channel of the ruts and makes it deeper. So what you have is these sunken roads with the trees arching over top. And there's some places where, these are still around, more in Europe than any place, but there are some beautiful places like this, and they are truly spectacular to walk through and to see. They're very special places, and if you find one, enjoy it. I'm not so sure about Anne's habits of naming things. The White Way of something or other. I can't remember, even though I just said it 4 times. Yeah, it's a beautiful place. I'm not sure about giving things. Then again, I'm not good at naming things. Absolutely horrid at naming things. But that's okay. I know what a thing is, and I can name some things. But anyway, White Way. Broadway in New York, big street in Broadway, is also known as the Great White Way. So if you ever hear the Great White Way, thinks Broadway, which is nothing to do with Prince Edward Island or Anne of Green Gables. But Great White Way, Broadway, the White Way of Beauty or something like that. But enjoy the nature around you. Look at things. Sometimes it's hard to know what to look at. Something else I wanted to point out. Matthew is thin. Marilla is thin. Anne is really, really thin. Matthew and Marilla are thin by nature. Some people are thin, some people are stocky, there's a lot that goes into it. Anne is underfed. This is something that you need to be aware of. The orphanages back in this time were not pleasant places. I mean, this is like Dickensian sweatshops. So if I'm going to read Oliver Twist, I'm probably going to read Oliver Twist later, maybe next. I don't know. But like Oliver Twist is, it's like these terrible places where you have little kids just working and working and working with no food and living in rags. And that's essentially what Anne was, because they said her dress was too short. So here you have a little girl who's underfed. And because she's underfed, she's going to be smaller and shorter than normal. And this dress was too short for her, which means that it was either a hand me down or this is an old dress. Actually, if it was hand me down, it'd probably be big, which means that this was an old dress. And she talked about a year and a half ago getting the material. So she's had this dress and quite likely should have grown several inches at this point. But it wasn't big enough. And it was too tight. And, being too tight on a thin person is really, really bad. So she's coming from this horrible situation. And Matthew is not the most noticing of person. He's not the most observant of people. And they pointed that out, that he didn't even really, little girl, maybe hair red. So he doesn't really observe these things. But even he knew that, she was excited about coming to him. And his experience is that just about everybody treats him as scary. So I understand where Matthew is coming from in a lot of ways here. And so here you have this person who thinks he's the most wonderful person in the world because he is saving her from something absolutely terrible. So he's planning to throw his sister under the bus and make her say, yeah, we got to get rid of you. But since it's Anne of Green Gables, and we have Anne now in Green Gables now, she's probably not going to leave. And I guess in the next chapter we find out about that.